We miss you, Space Boys. Are you still out there?
Once there was a space boy. Falling from Mars, sang to his audience, sang to the stars, but then suddenly one day there came this he disappeared from the earth, he left.
Marc is a versatile, multi-instrumental composer and singer-songwriter whose music spans a wide spectrum. I first discovered Marc when I found a cover that he did of a Bowie song that was comparatively conventional. But as I have explored his music in greater detail, it really ranges from the accessible and the familiar to the very challenging and conceptual. And we're going to talk about a couple of pieces of work that I think fall more in the latter category, although there's little hooks of familiarity within them related to outside and some of Bowie's other music as well. So, Marc, thank you. Welcome back. Thank you for joining me today.
Hello, John. Yes, good morning to you. And here in Tokyo, it's 10 p.m. So
great. Yes, Marc's in Tokyo, Japan. I'm in Albany, New York, about as far away from each other as we could possibly be. And that by itself, in my mind, is cool. But so let me just mention the two albums that we're going to talk about today. Some Kind of Future 2.0, which is, I would not characterize it exactly as a cover of Outside. And I'm going to say Outside rather than One Outside, just to, just for simplicity's sake. But the formal name of the album is One Outside. And we're also going to touch on a prior album that's related called Lost in the Minotaur's Lair. So, Marc, Some Kind of Future 2.0, it's not exactly a cover, as I mentioned. So let me sort of ask you broadly, what is it? What is the album?
Maybe I can start by saying what it's not, but you just said what it's not. From
Sorry.
perspective, right? I like to always start with, turning things on their heads. What is it? Well, it is a kind of tribute, I suppose, not only to the Outside album itself, but also to the sort of project that as you've already mentioned, and we've also spoken about on this page before, on your page, which is the Leon sessions, which were split into 3 suites of roughly 20 minutes each. And those were highly improvisatory sessions, not only improvised by, the musicians, the backing musicians, but also a lot of the lyrics and the themes and the characters that emerged from those sessions were improvised by David Bowie in the studio. And from that, then those characters emerged in a sort of loose plot, a kind of detective story, mystery, that also incorporated a number of Bowie's interests at the time, having to do with art and murder. Those things don't normally necessarily go hand in hand, but in his Outside drama, they do, and they did, and they do. And other things going on in the world. And part of it, you open by saying it's almost this cool thing that, Marc, you're in Tokyo on the other side of the world, and we're doing this. In 1994, 1995, when Bowie started recording the sessions and then later the Outside album, the internet was just kind of coming into its own, how can I say, it was a nascent, what he called in 1999, it's an alien life form, and it's going to change everything. And that interview now is, quite, quoted or shown on YouTube, whatever. And he's saying, it's going to change the world. And the interviewer says, but it's just a tool. It's just a tool. And Bowie says, no, it's an alien life form. it's like the telephone. They start putting the lines up, and suddenly you can do this, and then you have television, and then you have microwave ovens, and so on and so on. And now we're dealing with a future of perhaps robots and AI taking our jobs from us, or thinking for us. And I'd like to talk. That's actually when I get into. You haven't even asked the first question beyond what is it, but some of the themes that I actually tackle. This, in a way, is answering the question, kind of coming at it from the side, because what it is, perhaps, or how I perhaps think of it, and the first one that I did last year, the Minotaur's Lair, Lost in the Minotaur's Lair as well, to an extent, but more so, I think, this year with Some Kind of Future 2.0. I really am, I think, within the context of Bowie's sort of loosely using some of the characters that were created improvisatorially, is that the word? Via improvisation.
It is now.
It is now.
Yeah.
With right, thank you. Eno and co. Ramona A. Stone. In my version this year, she became Ramona AI. Although Ramona A. Stone, I also use the name Ramona A. Stone sometimes in some of the parts. Leon Blanc, who's on death row, perhaps, or at least he's been accused of murder, though perhaps it was actually Ramona, or perhaps she, staged it so that it looked like he did it. There's all these loose ends to the story. There's baby Grace Blue, who was the murder victim. And of course, we have a horrid cassette on the outside seg, where she's saying something is going to be horrid. Now, you haven't even asked your first question. Here I go. Let me just say a couple things, and then I'll let you talk again. But in the Leon Session seg, which is much longer, it's not a seg, it's part of the suite itself, the Ramona improvisation really gets into all kinds of wild things. And so, without getting into too much detail now, I'll maybe later, talk more about this. I kind of ran with some of the themes that are found not only in the Outside album, but especially in the suites, which are longer. The so-called shortened segs are much longer on the suites, and those things were in my mind, in my head. And so I did these long kind of improvisations for parts of it anyway, and we'll talk about, the structure of it later, because I'm sure you have questions about it. But I just ran with those themes, and I ended up sort of... in a sense, so what is it? It's a tribute to, obviously, Outside and its themes and the characters and some of the melodies and some of the song bits, but it's not like this or that or the other, except, as you say, I actually do have 3 sort of short cover songs, though they're rearranged. I will stop there and let you talk, because there's a lot to say about that kind of open the can, and then I'll let you kind of drive the car a little bit. Actually, there's a part in the Leon, he says, just who's driving the car? And that's kind of what it is here. It's like, maybe it's a Tesla autopilot car. See, that's another thing we could get into in Elias Mouse. Okay.
Well, not to get really sidetracked, but Bowie does seem to use driving as a metaphor. If I'm thinking of
round and round garage.
Yes, and also, the song "Your Turn to Drive," or she drives the big car. The act of driving seems to be metaphorical, but I don't want to go down that road. I want to go down a different road. So
we're going down a road, though. If we're in a car, we are driving.
Yes, we are.
I got that. Okay,
so
I'll go off the cliff.
If just before we get too far into this, I do want to make it just crystal clear that Some Kind of Future 2.0, as well as Lost in the Minotaur's Lair, they are full albums. Right. Yes. You could correct me if you think of them differently, but while there are songs on them or pieces there's some of the pieces on them, I don't, they really stretch the definition of what is a song, but they're sound, they're collections of sounds in discrete parts. But they are full albums. And I really, I listened to them and I really thought that they should be heard as a full work.
Yes.
And,
absolutely.
Okay. And I was thinking about, I'll tell you, it inspired me to think about something that I really hadn't put too much thought into prior, which is the subtitle of Bowie's album, Outside, which it might look like I'm reading because I am, a nonlinear Gothic drama hypercycle. And there we go. Right. And I want, and this is actually related to, directly related to your work. What does that mean to you? And specifically, what is a hypercycle? And are your albums hypercycles either in relation to each other and Bowie's work, or even within the package of the discrete album?
What does it mean to me? It means don't draw any conclusions from anything. Keep your mind open and get in. Yeah. If we're going to use the vehicle metaphor, get in, we'll go for a ride and see where it takes us. That's kind of what it is. And in fact, it's a hypercycle that was, not only is it open-ended in and of itself in terms of the outside album and or the Leon suites, which were improvised and so on, but also it kind of trails off into nothingness or infinity, because Bowie never completed the so-called cycle he had planned on completing in the first place, which was 1 outside, 2 contamination, and 3 Afrikaans, which I actually reference all three. I actually reference contamination and Afrikaans within the improvisations I do on the new piece. You're right. Now, let me go back to what you said about they really are full albums, and you said I got the sense, and thank you for recognizing this, that they should be listened to in this way. Now, to get to say something which also answers in part your question about my own work, apart from these 2 pieces or collections or whatever you want to call them, hypercycles, if you like, you can call them that. I don't mind. Pretty much every piece I do, whether it be a single track, let's say I do a single track that runs for 60 minutes. Well, then you can't break it up if it's on a single track, sorry. But let's say it's an album of 3 tracks that are longer, or let's say it's an album of 15 tracks, or whatever it is. And I actually have some albums that run much, go over the 70 or 80 minutes that would fit on a single CD, for example. So someone would say, well, then is it a double CD or double album or whatever? Now, here's the other thing about the concept of album for people of our generation and for people of much younger generations. Now, I teach, as you know, and you asked me about my Bowie course in the first interview we did as a Zoom interview, not the written one, but actually you may have asked me on that too. My students are like, 18, 19. They really don't have much of a concept of what is an album. It's like you get online and you click on the song you want to hear. And if you even have the attention span to listen to the whole song, you listen to it before you go to the next, or you go to a playlist on Spotify or I don't even know, TikTok or whatever it is. We grew up with Pink Floyd's The Wall double album concept. You listen from the first to the last, and it has a flow and a theme. Outside is certainly like this, and that's 1995. Even, in the 90s we're talking now, right? So 70s, I just jumped to the 90s with Outside, Bowie's of that generation. But now you look at things today, everything is just, Bowie he was always talking about how fragmentation, he said, fragmentation is one of my themes. It's always been. He says this in various places from the 90s onward, at least. I think even earlier than that, he was saying this. I would say my theme has been chaos. It's kind of the same. Yeah. But either way you put it, before talking about world and politics, and Bowie was talking about fragmentation of society. And when I say chaos, I also mean chaos within society and the world, but I also mean in various ways. And I'm sure Bowie did as well, apart from this. But getting back to your point and getting back to the idea of listening to these as a work, as an album, as a collection of songs in a particular order that have a particular flow, not only that, but they connect in various ways, the various threads. Which isn't to say you couldn't put them in a blender or a shaker and shake them up and see what happened, like Bowie did with his verbicizer in the 90s, which was a program on the computer, which actually did his Burroughs or Geisen, I think that's how it's pronounced. Cut-ups, right? Now, I'm going off topic, but it kind of relates. I've never used a cut-up technique with lyrics as Bowie used to cut, right in the 70s in the Diamond Dogs era, that documentary.
Literally cut the words.
Right, and then in the 90s he had someone design a program for him to do. Now, I don't use technology to do that. I don't need to, because I almost always improvise everything. Well, I haven't always, but from around 2020 or 2021 when COVID hit, for some reason, like, I guess I always had that aspect to my work or my songs. I would kind of brainstorm things, but in the early days, I would sit and write out lyrics A B, chorus kind of bridge kind of thing when I was in a band. That's how I wrote songs because they were structured that way in the bands I was in, and you had to do that. And then when I started doing solo things, my songs, I started writing songs a cappella before I could play a guitar or a keyboard. I was a drummer in middle school and I played clarinet in grade school, and I always loved singing. So, so anyhow, this is going into composition and other things. But
so let me stop you there, because
yeah, I know that's, if you don't stop me, it just could go on forever. So why don't you stop me and ask what you're going to ask, and I'll try to drive the car with you or sit in the back seat a little bit.
Okay.
A little bit, yeah.
So just by way of setting up the question, I mentioned that I was contemplating the subtitle of Bowie's album. And one of the things that occurred to me is the term hypercycle is not a term that I have come across often, if ever, outside the context of this album. And so I started looking, has that term been used elsewhere? And it in fact has. Yeah. But the thread, the meaning is a kind of connectivity. If you think of like a hyperlink.
That's where. That's what I think it is, because he was dealing with, and especially in the Leon suites, the internet.
Yes.
That makes total sense, because he mentions nerve, he says a nerve net, an internet, internets. And then the one of the characters who actually is also, as you know, in the outside on the seg on the album, even mentions on the album version, although he talks a lot more in the suites. Algeria Touch Shriek says the young, I sit here while the young advance in all electric, and I can't keep up with the technology like these young people. In the suites, there is a part where Bowie is talking about these internets and nerve nets. Now, Brian Eno, of course, produced the album, and they were doing this together. Brian Eno later released an album solo called Nerve Net. And I think Nerve Net came from the sessions where Bowie was improvising. He said Nerve Net, hypercycle, hyperlink. Then Bowie Net comes out in 99, I think, etc. And so Bowie was very interested in this technology. That interview I already cited was 1999, where he said it's an alien life form, it's going to change. But he was already, this is one of the major themes of Outside, apart from the ritual murder, the tattooing, the piercing, the going back to this kind of thing, which is another thing, and we can talk about. It's not so much in my version that as much, but the internet part is. Now, one other thing I wanted to say about, and this comes directly from the Bowie, his Leon suites. Again, not many people have listened to the Leon suites maybe that so closely, so this may be new for some viewers to your page or to my page, wherever they're watching this. Bowie also, there's one part, it's actually toward the very end of my version. There are different ways it's been edited. At the very end of the version that I have of the Leon suites, which is the full thing, but it's edited in a particular order. At the end, there's this he does this hammy voice, and he's going, the music's kind of going in the background, and Garson's sort of banging on the piano. They're doing their improv things, and Bowie goes, in his hammy voice, he goes, "One day, the internet may become an information superhighway. Don't make me laugh." And then he repeats it. He goes, "Do not make me laugh." Now, he saw that this alien life form, and this is 1994 when he recorded the suites that he was doing this improv, is going to just blow everything up and change the world, which it has. Of course, Bowie, they say he predicted what the internet was going to be, but he didn't, right? He didn't say we're going to have smartphones and we're going to have AI and we're going to have chat GPT. But he understood how big this thing was. Yeah. And, throughout the 90s, if we just talk about Bowie and his the way that he, we're talking now about Bowie, not about the album, which is fine. But this is the thing, right? Now, he saw the future, coming, and that the internet was a big part of the future, and that it was going to change. And he says in that interview, to go back to that 1999 interview, the interviewer is kind of like sitting there dumbfounded, like, but it's just a tool, and it's just this, and it's just that. And Bowie's like, you don't understand. This thing is going to change everything. And he says, I think we haven't even seen the tip of the iceberg. And he says, this is going to be both, what do you say? It's both exhilarating and terrifying, something like that. I don't remember exactly the words.
I don't remember the exact words either, yeah.
But it's like this, right? And so he got it. Now, in the mid-90s, he already had gotten it. We were doing dial-up in the mid-90s. I remember this so well, and this actually could lead into something on the first part of my 2023, but we'll get there. I'm sure you have questions about. And I want to talk about how and why and the timing of both of them, because, you know, my own. Yeah. But before we get there, just anyway, I know I go on and on, but so the internet, anyway, Bowie could see that. And that's definitely very, very, very strong in the Leon Suites. And it's in the Outside album, but less so. It's more prevalent in the Suites, as I've just given some examples of that. So I could use that also as a cue for other things, like The Enemy is Fragile. And maybe you want to ask about those things.
Yeah. I do. Let me sort of move off this by making two quick observations, and then I'm going to get into a different topic. The one is, you were talking a lot about how, I asked about hyperlinks and the hypercycle, and how very literally this is a topic that's covered by Bowie at that time in his own work. But metaphorically, in my mind, at least, it works with these two albums of yours in that there are almost like metaphorical hyperlinks to each other, to the songs within the albums, to Bowie's album, to the Leon Suites. And so that's one observation. The other observation is both you to some extent and Bowie to some extent are commenting on the concept of chaos. But in order to do that, there's an element of your music and of certainly the Leon Suites, and to a lesser extent, but certainly still with Outside. There's a sense that they are chaotic. However, even you just described the type of precision and work and coordination and planning that goes into creating the illusion of chaos, which is, I think, ironic, but that's also, I guess that's art, right?
I think I would flip that statement on its head in my own case when it comes to my process, which is that the chaos actually, well, there are different forms of chaos. How to go into this? Emptiness in form and form and emptiness. I actually did these two pieces called Emptiness in Form, Form and Emptiness. That comes from a Buddhist concept, which isn't only Buddhist. It could be any kind of spiritual tradition or any even physics or, these things. You talk about zeros and ones, plus and minus, light and dark, yin and yang. So within the chaos, there's some kind of form or structure or logic. And within any form of logic, there's going to be some chaos. And so I think that what Bowie was doing in the studio with the Leon Suites and what became the Outside album later, and what I was doing with these albums and what I do in my own work generally, which is also improvisation, right? You see, it takes a form of its own volition sometimes. And I know that sounds strange. It's like the more you let go, the more things just flow. And that's a kind of, like I say, when you talk about martial arts too, or we talked about Star Wars, and I said, John, actually that does apply, Yoda and yoga and philosophy and all the things. It's not even the philosophy, but it's like you let go and then it happens, you flow and the energy flows. And these albums, the connections that you noted between them, and I'm glad that actually I had mentioned just 2 days ago that I had done one last year even, right? That we're just going to talk about 2.0 and not the first, which does connect, but actually I wasn't even thinking about the first album when I did this. And I do want to talk about the process, especially for the second, but for the first as well, literally how I went about making them, because it's actually there was a lot of chaos in the making of them. I actually ended up making them in ways, and for some of the pieces anyway, that I hadn't planned on. And all of my work is sort of like that. And it sort of takes form as I'm doing it and as it happens. I don't pre-plan things much. I have ideas, and those ideas shape what I'm going to do. The idea, it's like, oh, I want to do this. Oh, I've got another idea. Let me do this. But I don't kind of structure it. I don't, I was a writer. I am a writer. I went to Brown University for creative writing. I've taught at Kyushu University for 8 years. I taught, academic writing, which is very structured, how to do citations. I do both sides of that coin, and I speak Japanese, and I've done some translation. I'm very involved in language and structuring things too. Like for an academic paper, you have to be structured. Structure is important, but so is breaking structure, or, letting that flow. So both sides are there. But what I wanted to say about writing, actually my writing, some writers very strictly outline and structure things before they even write the first word down. I've never once done that ever. And I'm speaking, this is going to go public. For Brown University, we had a creative thesis to do. Now, this is very different from what I did at University of Colorado Boulder for my master's in Japanese literature. That's totally different. That was more structured with citations. It took a long time, and I was in the library and doing research. But for the creative part at Brown, 2/3 of my thesis were short stories that I had written over the course of 2 years being in the program. And I collected them. Most of them were the ones that I liked. And of course I had edited them and worked on them more. But the other third of the thesis was a novella or a novelette. It was a very short novel. I wrote it in a single day from morning until night. And I think I maybe used the bathroom once the entire time. It just flew. It just came out of me like that. And that's kind of the way I make music now. I don't do from day to night, and I do use the bathroom when I need to, if I need to, or get a glass of water.
I hope so.
I'm getting older, and I kind of can't do that as much. That's kind of not good, or I get a sore back or sore neck because I'm not that young. But my point is that I don't sit and structure these things ahead of time. I don't. When you wrote to me, you said, do you want to know what my questions are? I said no, and you said I thought so, right? That's not. And when I do lecture for 90 to 100 minutes at university, I never bring notes. This is how I do. So, but I've got all this stuff in my head all the time, and so it just comes out like this. But so those connections, some of them may be, tentative, or they may just have happened, and it's like, I think when I listen to the Leon Sweets, that's what I get there too. That Bowie, that's the verbicizer too. He does a different way, but it's like, you just let chaos go. You say, like you take a sentence and you put it in a blender and then it comes out all messed up and you just spit it out on the paper. Now, Burroughs did that in Naked Lunch. And Naked Lunch is like, what the hell is this about? Well, he was tripping, right? Hey, man, everyone wants to say, hey, it must be psychedelics. But no, you don't need drugs or alcohol or anything like this to do this. Our brains are structured strangely. We want logic and conclusion always, but yet actually life is chaos. And we don't know what's going to happen in the next, in 2 minutes from now, we could have an earthquake and everything could be decimated in an instant, or I could drop dead of a heart attack. Literally, I think this way. So, what is not chaos in the world? Now, I'm not talking only about our political systems and these things we can talk about. Actually, they are part of my tributes, because those things came out. My themes are a little bit different from Bowie's themes in the mid-90s. So maybe I'll stop there and let you ask the next thing. So but yes, you're right that there are tentative or some things that definitely connect. Some of them, I went back and listened and said, oh, I didn't realize that I had actually mentioned or had a reference to that song or that theme last year. So actually, when I listened to last year's version back to back with the one I just made, I actually surprised myself sometimes. So I didn't plan all those things, actually. It's kind of weird, huh?
It's interesting. I kind of want to push back a little bit, because I accept that you're not. There's an element of the chaotic in the sense that, I accept what you're saying, that you're not planning everything out in advance. But then once you actually start assembling the work, there's an aspect of the idea that you're trying to put to sound, that it can't be chaotic. And I'll use an example from like the first piece on the album, which at this point I'll reveal uses my voice.
Yes. Yeah.
And if you just took that clip,
yes,
and you just plopped it on the beginning of the album, it would be very discernible, and it would carry the meaning that I intended to inject by speaking a series of words in a logical order.
Right.
The way you use it, and you use my voice this way, but you use your own voice the same way later, and you use you fade in and out where you're using the human voice in a way not to convey the meaning that's attached to the words, but to do something else. And that cannot have been random, because you're fading in and out. You're superimposing the sound of musical instruments over the voice. Yeah. And I don't think that you want the listener to pick up exactly what in this case, what I was saying, and to think that this piece was about whatever it was that I was talking about. Right. And I'll tell you, I took this to be kind of the jibber jabber that forms the background of not our dialogue, you and me, but our sort of the larger societal dialogue. And you're sort of hinting at this, that this piece of work is a commentary on the state of affairs today. So why don't you take that ball and run with it, especially if I got it wrong?
Well, there's no right and wrong. I said this to you in another. We actually had this conversation in a different conversation.
Yeah,
but
I remember.
Let me try to address it this way. Firstly, let's separate the listener's interpretation of a work, which is individual and is going to vary from listener to listener, person to person, just as our interpretation of events, what happened and how it happened, or whether we like something or we hate something. I might listen to one outside and it's very pleasurable and wonderful, and someone else might listen to it and might sound like noise and they might hate it and throw the CD in the trash. So that's an individual thing, but not just likes, dislikes, but also the way that we interpret and the way that so you just gave your interpretation of this, which wasn't necessarily something I had intended per se. Now, the second thing I want to just to separate and understand, when I talk about the composition of the album, or the way that I approach composing, or the way that I approached this, or the way that it's a lot of things sort of came out of me. I said it's improvisation. This will actually maybe lead into, I could maybe talk a little bit about how I approached it and how composed. And also, let's start with the very first track you mentioned with your voice. Now, that track, how that track came about is very different from the way that tracks The Enemy Within parts 1 and 2 were composed and came about. They're completely different. So we can't talk about them in the same language in a way, or in the same framework. So let me start with track number 1, which does use our interview clips. Now, if you've listened, actually, well, you'll definitely know this. You can probably relate this. You interviewed me about before and after COVID. So that's a perfect place to talk about how I use spoken word in my own.
Which is another album.
That's one of my albums that was a little more, you could say, personal in a sense, but also we talked about this in a separate interview if anyone wants to go and find it on my page, right? But also how it talks about COVID being something that we all kind of lived through. So it's not just about the composer or the writer, it's also about everyone's, but everyone interprets that differently, and everyone had a different outcome from that. So my before and after COVID also, again, would be very different from your before and after COVID, whether you're making an album or a memory or writing an essay about it. So that's the first thing. The way that spoken word is used in that and the way that I used it in the first track might be different. Now, I can tell you that the opening track, before your voice or my voice even enters the track, the very first sample I used, which I sampled myself, by the way, it's not something I took from the internet or anywhere else, was people chatting loudly. And that was, I was actually in a restaurant and it was really noisy. And I do these things. Shh, this isn't telling one of my secrets. I have my iPhone and I just press record and I just, I'm not like, eavesdropping. I don't care what people are saying. It's just white noise. And in fact, when I used the sample, I then ran various effects on it to make it sound even like less comprehensible and noisy and swooshy and stuff. So you have the noise. Now, the music or the other sounds on that track, and then I'll get back to the vocal sample and the sample of us talking, because there are other voice samples in that too. Now, there's some samples of me singing, and there's some backwards stuff too. A lot of it's backwards, because what I did was, and you've heard this, I did a version this year of Hello, Space Boy that I did not put on this album. I used it as the opening and the closing track on a solo album that's one of my recent releases for, it's called The Tower. Okay, so Hello, Space Boy was recorded for The Tower. That video you shared of mine during that very unfortunate, sad day where Trump won the election, and I did the election day mix. That was I kind of played with that and did a different mix of Hello, Space Boy. But then, actually, after I had done that, I got the idea to kind of run it in reverse and make it even more chaotic. Because already you said, right, it's dark, it's chaotic, noisy. Yeah. So what I did was I kind of ran that track in reverse. Then I opened it with the sample I had taken like maybe a month earlier that wasn't planned for this. You see, I do these things. I take samples and I'll use them a month later. I might use it 3 years later. Actually, I'll just take these random samples of things. You never know when it's going to come out again. And then I had the idea to open with our talk about the Leon sessions, and then of course I put different effects on that. Now, how you interpret that, the message of that, is up to you and any other listener. Now, the other part is that, like I say, it's basically, the other thing, again, I'm going really deep into the process. When I go into Logic, which is how I record and I do my mixing and things, and I often go back to tracks I've made and I actually reuse material in different ways. So the base for this was my version of Hello, Space Boy, which I actually also did multiple mixes. The Tower opens and closes with it, as I said. They're different mixes, they're different interpretations. The second version, I added different vocals to even. It like sometimes I can add or subtract. So what I did was I subtracted all of the vocal line from the Hello, Space Boy, which is, Space Boy, you're sleepy now, literally the vocal. But you hear me singing parts of all these different songs from the Outside album and maybe bits of Leon, Enemy is Fragile, Wishful Beginnings, etc. I don't even remember. I know Heart's Filthy Lessons in there and other things that were improvised. That was like in the background of my Hello, Space Boy. So that part is emphasized, but then a lot of the stuff runs backwards. We have the noise and our talk and then some other stuff. That opens you up. Now, let me just quickly talk then, because this is answering your question as well. When I talk about improvising and how it was not pre-planned, that part, let me first make this clarification. That part is what we're talking about here is arrangement, mixing, arranging, and then also after arranging things from what I have or have recorded or have made, or then I might add things or subtract things, and then I have the tracks, and then I have the titles, and then I have to decide, which goes back to listening to it in order, the order of the tracks and the flow, and if I'm going to fade things in or out, and if I'm going to put this or that effect or layer it. That is arrangement. The arrangement is not 100%, but it's not 100%. That's not improvisation. That part, you're right, that takes planning and time, and it's meticulous. You are correct. But I want to make this clear when I say I'm not lying that it's, I mean, in other words, that it's, these are two different.
I'm not saying you're lying.
No, because you said I can accept this, but I'm really having a hard time understanding. So to explain the process, this is arranging, this is considering after the fact, after those things have been, like Pollock or whatever, you throw the paints on the thing.
I was very much thinking that Jackson Pollock.
Yeah, but Pollock isn't just throwing paint either. He might be at times throwing paint, but then some image might come as he's throwing the thing, and then it might sort of change. So after the fact, I can go and I can shape it and I can remix it or reverse it or add or subtract or layer or put effects or take effects off and so on. So this is arrangement. Now, The Enemy Within, if you watch the video, I don't know if you had a chance to watch the video that I sent you, which is separate from the audio. The video is me walking through the street with an iPhone, literally recording myself, filming myself. The soundtrack to both parts 1 and 2, which again, that came in the arrangement where I split it, came from me literally walking through the neighborhood and improvising the entire thing. And if you don't believe me, watch the video. It's uncut.
Yeah.
I did effector. Afterwards, I effectorize it. It's got effects. It turns black and white. It has layering and coloring and all things. And I mixed it and I added things to the mix. But actually, if you listen, you will hear like trains in the background. And at one point, you hear these people shouting and clapping and stuff. And I go, there they are, the leak soldiers. That was literally improvised because there was a bunch of people on the corner. And I said, this is the world of 2024. And so I literally riff off of what's going on in the environment around me. Now, I want to say something else about that.
So I just want to...
The Enemy Within, part 1, and then part 2 as well. But that's composed differently with my suling flute. So that's a different thing.
Let me come back to The Enemy Within, but just the description of the walking down the street and improvising off your environment. Yeah. It reminds me of the Bowie's video for DJ, where he's walking down the street. Right. And he just uses
someone else is filming that, whereas I'm just I'm literally filming myself.
Yeah.
And so that was my raw source material. So became
we're talking about earlier, we were talking about linkages, and The Enemy Within is a piece, but also this phrase that is in that song, the enemy is fragile, that pops up throughout the album. It's just not limited to that.
Yes.
Right.
Good.
And I just just two other things that reminds me of within the album is there is a reference to January 6th, which is sort of a play on the beginning of the One Outside album, where you hear Bowie citing different dates that sound like they have some meaning, but he doesn't really tell you what the meaning is.
Absolutely.
And so just as a very personal interpretation of January 6th, so that's my birthday. So most people think of January 6th as the day that there was an insurrection in the United States. But so this is the most personal possible linkage. So I'm listening to this, and one of the first things I hear on this album is my voice. I then hear my birthday, and then you included a version, and this is one of the more accessible versions of a piece of music on the album of I'm Afraid of Americans. Yeah. Where the central character is Johnny, who's in America, and that's me, right? So,
well, no, because Johnny's kind of a jerk, and you're not.
I know.
It's not you, and I'm not afraid of you either. So it's not.
Yeah. Well,
again, you see how personal interpretation can be. This is the perfect example, and also the fact that the coincidence. Now, I teach I'm teaching Paul Auster's City of Glass, which is a detective story very much like Outside. You could almost say is maybe even influenced by. This is written in the mid-'80s, and it's an open-ended mystery that happens in New York.
Yeah.
Where Auster was living, and it's metafiction, and Auster appears as a character in his own novel. I won't go into it too much. I could talk about this all night because I've been teaching the class, but I also teach something called the Red Notebook of his, which is nonfiction and which deals with chance and coincidence and interpretation of things, which is also part of his fiction. And he talks about like this incident that influenced his life. This kid got struck by lightning right in front of him. It could have been him if it was 3 seconds later. And all these things that happen by chance. Now, just by chance, that date happens to be your birthday. By chance, I ended up putting I'm Afraid of Americans. Johnny's in America. You're in America, New York. I also mentioned Red Notebook. I say I'm putting notes in my Red Notebook. I'm investigating a crime. Now, Bowie didn't mention Red Notebook. That was Paul Auster mentioned. And that was all improvised because it was, I'm teaching the class. It's in my head. Now, how the listener interprets is up to the listener. So let me say something else. The Enemy is Fragile, number 1. Number 2, I'm Afraid of Americans. And January 6th. And the opening of Outside. Right? So the opening of Outside, yes, the dates. I was literally walking through the streets just recording this thing and riffing. All the stuff about the Minotaur, which goes back to last year's, which at some point maybe I want to mention something about that piece as well. But the Minotaur is not nearly as heavy this year. Last year was really, the focus was on the Minotaur artist character. And this year, the focus is more on, the political situation, the chaos in the world. It was last year too. And in fact, one of the characters, I know I'm going off again, but it does relate, Elias Mouse. I won't say who that is, but I think you could probably guess. And I mentioned Elias Mouse and brain patches last year, and I actually mentioned Elias Mouse this year. And so that connects between, I don't know if you caught that reference, brain patches in Bowie's, let me go back to this Bowie's Leon. There's a thing in one of the segs about soul patches, and that this leader is making everyone. This is in Baby Grace's longer version of the horrid cassette on the Leon session. That everyone has to wear soul patches. The leader makes we all have to wear soul patches, and now I must be quiet, and something's going to be hard. They're coming to get me, and then she's killed. Right. So the soul patches in mine becomes brain patches, and it's Elias. I almost slipped. Elias Mouse. That was last year's Minotaur's Lair, and this year, I think it's in the second part of The Enemy Within. I'm thinking of Elias Mouse. So he comes back, and you can interpret brain patch and nerve net and etc. and neura ... You interpret. If you see the video, actually, I have a subliminal flash the thing visually, so I'm not going to say any more because I like to leave things a little bit open.
Yeah.
And without giving everything away. Bowie did this too, and there's a reason. Because if you give it, it's no fun anymore.
You can't give everything away.
I can't give it all away, man, either, because, so this is the man here. And, actually, this is another, it's not a coincidence, but I had put these here. You can't see them. I was thinking his backing, I would have Bowie's outside of this is an original album. And I thought it's kind of like not that different, right? I mean, it's not intentional at all, just the face. And of course, used in a different way. This is not a painting, but it's kind of that. But anyway, so I'm getting ahead of myself.
So
I'm getting behind myself. And other things I was going to mention about the composition of the two and the themes. You can remind me.
Well, rather than remind you, I'm conscious of the time, and there's a lot of questions that I have that I don't think we're going to have a chance to go over. So maybe we continue this conversation. But I do want there's two things I do want to ask.
Yeah, I remembered, but go ahead.
Okay. So there's two things that there's three things I want to ask before we wrap up this meeting. The one is, so you just mentioned the centrality of the Minotaur in last year's album.
That's right.
And one of the things that I listened to it recently, and then I listened to the new album, and I thought that the central figure in the new album is really Leon Blanc.
Yeah.
And the question I wanted to ask you is, what function does the Minotaur play both for you and for Bowie? And they're serving a purpose, and what is it?
Absolutely. And I think it was subconscious in my case. Not totally subconscious. Okay. Maybe Leon was subconscious, but maybe that's also because the enemy was fragile. The enemy is fragile. Plays such a central role in this year's work. And there is a reason for that. And that was conscious because I was actually planning on doing a cover of that, thinking that I wanted to cover something that was only on the Leon Suites, but which was kind of a song in and of itself that never got sort of published on Outside or anywhere else. And I think The Enemy is Fragile is one of the best songs that never was, except for all of us weird, sort of obsessed Bowie people. The Enemy is Fragile, I think, is a brilliant piece in and of itself. It's like a 5-minute song. It's not even that long. So The Enemy is Fragile. When I was walking, as I was talking earlier, and improvising, I was singing parts of it, and then it became a longer improvisation. I ended up just not editing that improvisation. I did split it into two halves, and I did musically change things in the background. But so Leon kind of became central. Leon, I'll start with Leon, then I'll talk about the Minotaur, because they do have different sort of, roles, as you say, functions, and these are different albums, and I recorded them 14 months apart. So obviously my brain is in a different place, and obviously the world is in a different place than it was 14 months ago as well. Let me start again with Leon, as I said, just to be consistent, and this year's version. So in 2.0, and there's, by the way, a meaning there's at least a double meaning, if not a triple meaning behind 2.0. But I won't even go there. Some kind of future. Yes, I guess Leon, you could say, in a sense, is central, as well as my outsider seg, which I wanted to mention, which is an original so-called, it's a character that is just anonymous outsider, just as the second saga this year's is Ramona AI, Confessions of a former futurist, because there's no future. How can one ever be a futurist if there's no future? So there's no future. And actually, there's so much I could talk about here. There's a lot of connections, but I won't because of time. But the so what does Leon represent, to answer your question, and then to talk about the Minotaur? Leon is the outsider. He is he's an outsider because he's outside the law in a way, or he's outside. He's being accused of a crime he very likely didn't commit because of his, circumstance, and because perhaps Ramona is jealous or spiteful because Ramona was so cold when she broke it off with Leon. She said, I've had enough of you, basically, right? And so if you read the outside hyper psycho gothic drama linear notes of Nathan Adler's diary, there's some talk of what happened between them and how he may have been framed by Ramona. So he's an outsider in this sense. He's an outsider in that sense. He's in Oxford Town, or he says, I have not been to Oxford Town yet. Here I am I'm in this damn jail cell, with my stinking mattress and what could have been, and etc. So he is the archetype, if you will. That's a very Jungian word, but for the outsider with a capital O.
Yeah.
Again, my original character, for which just sort of happened, is an outsider. So I guess this year's version, in a way, is more outside than last year's was, in a sense, because also, as you mentioned, it has I'm Afraid of Americans, which of course was on the Earthling album, but also was recorded originally as I'm Afraid of the Animals with Brian Eno. And that's a kind of also, who's going to get that? The real hardcore people will get that. So, but also We Prick You and what was the other one? I'm forgetting. Voyeur of Utter Destruction is Beauty. Now, those were recorded. Actually, We Prick You was recorded last year. But the other two were recorded in 2018, I think. So they were remixed and rearranged. And last year's We Prick You, that's why they're also 2.0, because they're literally remixes or rearrangements of things I previously recorded, but they sound different. That's why they're 2.0. And that's why I also changed the titles. Also, so the outsider, so that's why you sensed, I think, Leon, or that outsider feeling. Ramona, of course, is always there, and she's there this year, definitely, with the AI thing and, being there in the background. And also, oh, Ramona, where has the future gone? And this has been a theme all over a year now. In my This Dark Shroud original music, I did a song called Oh, Ramona, Where's the Future Gone, which actually became part of the basis for the Minotaur's Lair suite. So now I'll jump to the Minotaur's Lair last year. That forms part of the central section of that, along with a piece I had done at the very end of 2022, because I had planned on actually doing the Outside tribute then, and it took almost a full year before I ended up doing it. My hard drive crashed. I lost data. Fortunately, I'd gotten that. I did a 5-minute piece, and it was entitled Seg, Minotaur/Artist. And that became the basis for the longer Minotaur's Lair piece on the Minotaur's Lair album, which is one of the central pieces. The other is Strangers When We Improv, which I'd started as was going to be Strangers When We Meet. It opens like that, right? It's just the melody on piano, and it became a piano improv and then a vocal improv where I started riffing off of themes. The Minotaur, to answer your question and not to suck up too much time, trying to do my best here, I had done, prior to recording the album itself, like I said, I had done the Minotaur Artist Seg the year before, less than a year before, and released it on an EP on David Bowie's birthday. And by the way, 2.0, I'm planning on releasing January 8th. That's why I decided to do it now. The Minotaur's Lair I decided to do last minute almost, because the anniversary of Outside in September, I think 25th, was coming up, and I wanted to release it on the day. So this year I wanted to do January 8th, because I always do something. 2 years ago I did, or 2023 I did on January 8th. No, 2022. Or 23, I'm all confused now. The EP, which included the Minotaur Artist piece. And then on September 25th, I released, last year, 2023, Minotaur's Lair, or Lost in the Minotaur's Lair. So before I recorded the album itself, as I said, I had done a long talk on why be an artist, why make art, and that talk, which is on my YouTube page, and I'll include a link if you wish, or I can tell you the link or whatever. I can edit it in. I start with a Bowie. I use a clip of David Bowie being asked a question during a conference in 1995 on Outside. It's like over an hour, like this thing where he's just talking and answering questions about Outside. And the person asked him about improvisation and, like, where do the ideas come from? And would you consider improvising on stage? And he says, well, I think I'm confusing my audience enough as it is, And then this thing goes in the background. And this is one of those chance things. He goes, and he's like in the middle of a sentence and he goes, oh, that said it better than I could. Next question. And I use this clip to start the talk. And then I say, why do art if you're going to just confuse the hell out of an audience anyway? No one's going to buy it. No one's going to care. Bowie had to kind of water down, in a way, the Leon suites for Outside. And then he moved in a more commercial direction and went more. Okay. So in the talk, I ended up talking not only about Outside and Leon suites a bit, and this is just me sitting in my room talking, but the Minotaur as the central figure, as the artist figure. Now, the artist is also an outsider, okay? So like Leon, the Minotaur is also an outsider, but the Minotaur is also animalian. And it's the part of the outsider that is artist, that is also, I'm deranged. I'm deranged. There's no control. Now, Nathan Adler sings No Control. The Minotaur sings I'm deranged. Nathan Adler has part of the Minotaur within him when he sings No Control. The Minotaur has part of, humanity in him. And the Minotaur is also a lonesome figure, and etc. And I talk about this in this talk. So he became the central figure. And in fact, again, if you talk about using spoken word, I used parts of my own talk about Minotaur's Lair. If you listen, you hear me talking about Bowie and Outside and the Minotaur in the background as part of a sample in that song. So it's meta as well, kind of like Paul Auster. Yeah. I'm talking about the Minotaur and the artist. That became a central theme, and I entitled the album Lost in the Minotaur's Lair. And I talk about how the Minotaur is one of the only character that doesn't have a seg. And I created a seg, and I use an effector on my voice to sound really evil. And it's, if you're looking for simple, looking for answers here, you will be bitterly disappointed. And that goes back into the whole hypercycle thing. So I'll end what I have to say there for that.
Well, so I want to sort of end this discussion by relaying to you my experience in listening to specifically some kind of Future 2.0.
Yeah.
And I'm going to relay this experience and then ask you a question.
Sure.
Wrap up this discussion. So you sent it to me, and I started listening to it while doing other things. So it was on in the background, so to speak. And first of all, I was interrupted. So I did not listen to the whole thing through in one sitting. And the other thing is, after being interrupted, I decided to listen to the whole thing straight through while I wasn't doing anything else. And I felt like that was really the way to appreciate it. And I was thinking about music and what does music do? And there's a lot of music, including music by David Bowie and Brian Eno, that is intentionally ambient, which very much works as something that's happening in the background. There's other music that is happy music that you dance to, or that it's nostalgic, or that it triggers some kind of psychological effect that doesn't involve a lot of thought. That's not this, right? I really felt like, I needed to focus on the entirety of the work. And just another thing about the experience, the first few songs were so, I would say, disorienting, that by the time we get to We Prick You, that I latch on to a piece of familiarity, even though, 9 out of 10 people who are familiar with the album One Outside would probably not name that as one of their most familiar songs from the album, right? Yeah. Or the most accessible song. Yeah. But it's like, okay, this is something that's familiar, and it sort of reorients me. And then that experience was sort of replicated when we get to I'm Afraid of Americans. So I imagined that this almost should be experienced in concert or as accompanied by some kind of performance art. But that's not how people are going to experience it. So if somebody wants to hear this, first of all, how would they access it? Where would they find it? And secondly, how does the artist, you, recommend experiencing it?
In terms of just a very practical question of where to find it, right now it's in 2 places, but it will be in a lot more places on David Bowie's birthday or the anniversary of what would have been January 8th, because it will be published on Apple Music, Spotify, and all the majors through my my distributor. But right now it's on my YouTube page in full with forgetting the word. I put the time stamps where you can you can navigate that way, and titles. And I think you maybe saw that. And it's on my Bandcamp page, which it can be downloaded for free, 100% for free. You just click the thing and it downloads. So anyone can go and just download it for free. Now that goes to how do I recommend listening to it? That's up to the listener. If you prefer, if you, meaning some general anybody, one prefers streaming, one prefers YouTube, fine. That's why it's there. If one prefers higher fidelity sound and higher quality MP3 or WAV or some other format, one can go and download that for free and also have it on one's device offline.
I get that. That's not what I meant.
No. But the second part is, it's precisely what you said, but not just this. Not just this. I would say anything that I've ever made preferably should be listened to while one is sort of paying attention and not sort of putting it on as BGM. Now, that's not to say that music cannot be enjoyed as ambience in the background while multitasking, if you will, or, doing the dishes or doing something else. But that's a different experience from listening closely or carefully. And I would argue that that's a different experience even with something that is, as you mentioned, ambient and can be listened just in the background. But if you listen to it in the background and you're distracted, and say you listen to the same piece on headphones with your eyes closed and you're really concentrating, it's going to bring you to a totally different place, and you're going to notice things you never noticed before. And in fact, I would even argue that every time you listen to it, depending on the state of your own being, in other words, if you're in a good mood, a bad mood, you're relaxed, you're irritated, you're going to experience that same exact thing in a different way. Now, that is what music for me does and should do. That goes back to the thing about how people just, no attention span, next, we're scrolling. It's actually messing with our brains, John. It's changing the way we think. This is part of, in a way, what Bowie was maybe talking about. The internet's going to change us. I don't know if that was the aspect he had gotten, but that, we could have a library at our fingertips, whereas kings in ancient Rome would never have access to all the things that the average person does today on the train. But on the trains in Tokyo, what I see are zombies, in the little video game worlds, and not even like hello. And I think at one point I say something about, it's not, Leon's not in the newspapers anymore. He's on our telephone, I say, which was, I was improv. I said, because we're looking at our devices and we're not connected to reality. Reality is what's on the news, and all these like ratcheting up of tensions around the world, and my bomb is bigger than yours, and when is World War III going to start? And it's like really just, I'm going into another thing because we didn't talk at all about the political side, but to get back to your thing, right, that's really an important theme, but I'll let the listener listen. So that without me going on about the political part, that's for the listener to interpret and listen. And January 6th might just have been because it's your birthday, and I thought that was cool, and that was an Easter egg just for you. But you're not like Johnny, believe me. So that part,
no,
that's not, that wasn't you. Definitely, John. You're not that Johnny. But
I didn't think that was your intent.
Johnny Maggiore is not Johnny in America. Yeah. But how is it best to listen to my music or any music? If you want to party and dance, listen to it in a dance club. Don't focus on the lyrics and let the beat flow through your body and be in the moment of the beat when it's techno or something. Yeah, and I like that too. And I do this orchestra with heavy beats sometimes too. So I'm not like saying that's not equally, or having nostalgic 80s music for us would be like the 80s or even the 90s. But this music, indeed, what you intuited, I would agree, and I appreciate the fact that you got it, and that you got that they're meant to be listened that way, and that the connections, you can only make those connections for yourself or in any way by listening carefully, by concentrating, not multitasking while listening to a piece.
Yeah.
And I think that's what any art should do, whether it's music or visual or, painting or even reading a book. If you're reading a book and you're kind of only half concentrated, you might just, even if it's just a very simple plot line you're trying to follow, you lose even that. But if it's
right. I thought
a philosophy book, you just can't even, you don't even know what the hell you're reading anymore.
I thought listening to this album was more like reading a book than putting on, the best of the Beatles.
Yeah.
Or even
it depends which Beatles it is, because number nine. If you listen closely, that's pretty cool.
That's why I said the best of the Beatles, right?
Yeah, I know.
So like
right, not the worst of them, right?
But not that number 9 is the worst, but wouldn't be on a
I love that
album.
piece. I love the piece. I know, I'm joking.
But even the Bowie album that this was inspired by, One Outside, it's one of the 5 albums I've listened to the most since it was released nearly 30 years ago. Yeah. And so at this point, when I can listen to it in the background, and I don't sort of examine its fundamental premises just because I've heard it so frequently. Right. So here's, in closing this interview, I'm going to supplement what your advice is to potential listeners, because I think if at this point people are going to want to listen to it, and now they know how to find it. So my advice would be to find the time to just carve out and approach it like you would be reading a book or a long magazine article, to focus on it, focus on the whole thing. Don't, if you can avoid any kind of interruption, my experience was it doesn't work. If you're interrupted and then you try to listen to it pieces at a time. I really think that it's music to focus on, and a piece of art that really pushes boundaries in terms of what you might even consider music to be. But if you do focus on it, there's a lot there to think about, and there's a lot there to experience, and it evokes multiple feelings and emotions, which is something that art can do. And I thought that this piece of art did that well, and did it in a way that Mariah Carey's not going to achieve.
Well, so because there's a different thing behind it. May I kick back one last question to you off of that? Yeah. I would love to hear you. You have, because you interviewed me about before and after COVID, and you've listened, I know, in full to the album that preceded that, which is Angels of Time. Would you say anything different about those albums in terms of the way to approach them, or not? I'm curious about your experience of those, listening to those piecemeal versus sitting and concentrating. Is it any different?
I would agree. And
I'm curious.
I would agree.
I'm not asking agree or disagree. I'm curious what you felt listening to those, as opposed to say if it was different or the same, or because those are original albums, quote.
Right.
These are 2 actually, but they have a very strong reference point, and I'm using, melodies and lyrics and things. If it's any different.
It's different in 2 ways.
Yeah.
When I say I agree, the conclusion that I reach is that they should be listened to in whole, in a way that the listener can concentrate. But here's the 2 differences in the experience.
Yeah, I'm curious about that. Your perception or experience. Yeah.
So with some kind of Future 2.0, I had the benefit of being interrupted. So I had the benefit of learning how not to hear it, which was not the case with those 2 earlier albums.
I see.
The other thing that I'll say that is, I think, characteristic of all 3, as well as Lost in the Minotaur's Lair, is I found with all 4 of these pieces that as soon as I move on to the next thing, as soon as I'm done, I start losing some of my retention of how I felt and what I was thinking, and even what I remember. So before we had this interview, we had a back and forth, and you asked, did you listen to the whole of Lost in the Minotaur's Lair? And I actually couldn't remember. Yeah. And the reason I'm saying this is that all 4 of these pieces of work are really, my experience was the optimal experience is in the moment. And the moment should be an extended moment, which is to experience it from beginning to end. I'm not saying I didn't retain anything from them after it's over, but really the optimal experience is in the moment of listening to these things without focusing on anything else, without multitasking, not in the background. And it's, there's a lot going on. So I would say that those are common characteristics. I would not have answered the same question the first time I listened to your first full album because I didn't have the experience of being interrupted. I didn't have the multiple albums to reflect on. But that's my answer. That's how I'd respond to that question.
That's beautiful. I Angels of Time.
Yeah.
Before and after.
Yeah.
COVID.
Yeah.
What is time?
Yeah.
And what is the moment now? Not tomorrow, yesterday, it's happening now.
Yeah.
And what was happening in 1994 and 1995 is happening now, and it's also not happening now. But what's happening now is happening now because of what preceded it in 1994, 1995, yesterday, this moment that's slipping away, even as our time is ticking and this interview is about to end. And after I press stop, this moment is gone. It's in the past. It only exists as a memory or as a video. And so that is a very strong theme throughout my work. And that's perhaps why you'll notice the connections and links, not only between my tributes to other artists such as David Bowie and others, by the way. And by the way, I have a Laurie Anderson reference at the end of the piece where I do Wishful Beginnings and Through These Architects' Eyes, where I'm singing both lines atop one another. And I'm just giving a hint here to anyone who wants to pursue that. There's a bit of a Laurie Anderson reference at the end of that. That's not even a Bowie reference. So there are all kinds of threads everywhere. And time and moment. And if you're multitasking, anyone's multitasking, or you're flipping or you're scrolling your screen, it's just not going to happen because that's just not how it happens. It's happening now. So thank you for that. That's a lovely, and maybe if you go back, and I'm not saying do this, and listen, say, to even Angels of Time again, you had a particular reaction the first time we talked in private, like on email about, you might actually feel differently if you heard it again.
Yeah, I'm sure I would.
After listening to these other albums and kind of catching on to what's going on in the work. And then if you listen to something else, you might link it in another way. So my work does connect everything else in a way. Yeah. Even going far back to Black Nail in 2017, which is why I frequently revisit my own pieces and redo, and also to end, which is also why I decided to do my One Outside tribute again this year, right? So I say, I did an Outside tribute. Why don't I do, this year I'll do Diamond Dogs. And there are references I'm sure you caught to Diamond Dogs.
Yeah.
Because obviously, in my mind,
the whole line of questioning that I abandoned, but
that's absolutely, and that was improvised, but that came out, We Are the Dead, and I actually covered We Are the Dead. I did my version of that last year. I haven't covered the song Diamond Dogs. I did We Are the Dead.
Wow. Let's leave that as a teaser for perhaps a different conversation.
That's a great place to end.